If you had to choose between one of the three things, money, power, or influence, what would you choose?
Yeah, so I would answer it with influence because influence gets you money and power. That's the route to ensuring that you will acquire those kinds of resources. So, influence for me is the ability to move people in your direction with a proposal or a recommendation or a request without changing the merits of that proposal, recommendation, or request one bit, just changing the way you present those merits.
How do we become truly influential? How do we become masters of persuasion in our personal and professional lives? How do we identify leading indicators for stock market growth just based on how a company responds to a crisis or how a company influences its customers and peers? We're talking about these issues with our next guest, who is an expert on persuasion and influence. He is Dr. Robert Cialdini, the Regents Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Marketing at Arizona State University, and the President and CEO of Influence at Work and the founder of Cialdini Institute. His past clients in the corporate world have included the biggest companies in the world, such as Google, Pfizer, Microsoft, Coca-Cola. He's even advised NATO and the U.S. Department of Justice and Thomson Reuters. He's written a book, best-selling book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion and Persuasion, A Revolutionary Way to Influence and Persuade, 2016. They've sold more than 5 million copies. Charlie Munger has called Influence one of the most important books he's ever read and has recommended it to a lot of people. Fortune magazine lists Influence in their 75 smartest business books. And for his scientific contributions, Dr. Cialdini was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Scientists in 2018 and the National Academy of Sciences in 2019. Dr. Cialdini, an honor to host you today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be with you and your audience.
Dr. Cialdini, like I mentioned, Charlie Munger, former Berkshire Hathaway vice chairman, read your book Influence and sent you one share of Berkshire Hathaway Class A in the mail.
Yeah,
The share at the time was worth $75,000. It's now trading at around $615,000. First of all, do you still own that share?
I own that share. And there's an interesting reason why I do. It's that um, Buffett and Munger are not only great financial analysts and investors, they're great at the psychology of informing their prospects and their current stockholders to stay with them. And I was persuaded as well by the way that they present their case in the letter that they send, the annual letter that they send every year to stockholders.
It wasn't just Munger who liked your book. Yeah, Fortune magazine listed Influence in their 75 smartest business books. But going back to Berkshire Hathaway, so at a speech, 1995 speech at Harvard University, Munger said that you're all going to be given a copy of Cialdini's book. And if you have half as much sense as I think you do, you will immediately order copies for all of your children and several of your friends. You will never make a better investment. I guess you made a profound impact on the way Charlie Munger has thought about influence and persuasion. To what extent do you think your book has influenced the way Berkshire Hathaway thought about investments, if you were to go that far?
Well, I'll just um, replay what happened when I got that envelope in the mail with the note from Charlie. He said, "Your book has made us so much money that by the first principle of influence in your book, which is the principle of reciprocity, that says we are obligated to give back to others who have first given to us, who have benefited us. Here's a share of Berkshire Hathaway stock to play by the rules of reciprocation that exist in all human societies, right? That we say yes to those we owe. So if we give first, if we're the ones who provide benefits or advantages or opportunities for people, before we ever do business with them, they want to do business with us. They want to say yes to us, partially because we're good people, but also because it's their turn. They want to give back to us. So I always advise, if you're ever going into a room, let's say you're going to make a pitch to people, you don't know those individuals, you want to make a good showing. You don't go in the room saying to yourself, who can most help me here? You go in saying, whom can I most help here? Whose circumstances can I advance here? Whose outcomes can I benefit here? And if you do that, you have an advocate in that room. You have a supporter in that group who will see to it that you are benefited, that your outcomes are enhanced.
Before we continue with the interview, a quick shout out to our sponsor today, iTrust Capital, an IRA that offers 35 crypto assets and the lowest trading fees in the crypto IRA space at 1%. It also offers securitized gold. So learn more at the link down below, itrust.capital/David. With gold and Bitcoin having hit all-time highs this year, now might be a good time to look into an IRA to park your returns. It also offers competitive tax benefits, so click on the link down below to learn more. And if you fund your account using my referral link, you'll get a $100 signing bonus. Well, how does that, we'll get to the other principles in just a minute, but how does that aspect, the reciprocity principle, how does that translate to making money? And in the case of Charlie Munger, I guess, making returns on his investment.
So it involves making presentations to that benefit somebody, giving them information that enhances their outcomes. Because you happen to know it and they don't, you might have a prospect or somebody who you'd like to influence, and you know that you see something at a conference or in a magazine, riding on a plane, that would be directly relevant to that person's industry, right? Forward it to him. Forward it to that person. That person will feel that you're not interested just in selling yourself. You're interested in enhancing their outcomes, right? They want to enhance yours in return.
The 6 principles of persuasion: reciprocity, you just mentioned, liking, commitment, scarcity, authority, and social proof. Can you, before we get into the finance aspect, can you maybe just walk us through the inspiration or the impetus of working on this book and how you arrived at these 6 principles?
I started out as a university professor researching the persuasion process in my laboratory, normally with undergraduate students who I would make a request or a proposal this way to them in an experiment and see how much they agreed with it. Or this way, the same proposal, but I would change the words, I would change the sequencing, or I would change the associations or the images in that message. And now I would get this much agreement. So that's how I built my understanding of how the influence process was working. But I realized this was a poor representation of the way that influence occurs outside of my laboratory and outside of my college campus and my experiment. I needed to get into the places where the influence wars are being fought every day. So I enrolled in as many influence training programs as I could get access to. I learned how to sell cars. I learned how to be a marketer. I learned how to be a public relations specialist. And I looked for the factors that they were all using to get their customers or prospects to say yes. And there was a very small footprint, just the 6 that you mentioned. So I put each one in a book, each one in a chapter in my book. And that's how I got to be speaking about these principles to a larger audience than just academic researchers.
I want to learn a little bit more about your research. This reminds me of a question that a friend of mine asked me once. The question was, if you had to choose between one of the 3 things, money, power, or influence, what would you choose? I guess I'm trying to get you to define what influence means, but how would you answer that question first?
Yeah, so I would answer it with influence, because influence gets you money and power. That's the route to ensuring that you will acquire those kinds of resources.
And
influence for me is the ability to move people in your direction with a proposal or a recommendation or a request without changing the merits of that proposal, recommendation, or request one bit, just changing the way you present those merits.
How is that different from coercion or exercising power?
Yeah. So that's really a good question. That's crucial. Power involves coercion or intimidation or brute force, ordering people into alignment with your recommendations or proposals. That can get temporary success, but those people resent it. Those people who are targets of that kind of coercive power wait till you're not able to monitor them and they go around the side of it. They won't comply. They will, in fact, do the opposite if you're not present to exert that power. Influence is telling people, giving people information, educating them into assent, right? Because they see the merits of your case more clearly than before because of the way you've delivered that case.
And a good influencer, if you want to use that term, does he or she have to have all of these six qualities?
No, but they accumulate. So if you know more of the six principles and are able to apply them in the situations that confront you, if you know about more of them, you will be commensurately more successful.
I like to understand a little bit more about what each of these principles mean, starting with what we talked about reciprocity, um, liking, we've mentioned that, commitment. Well, what does that mean?
So people want to be consistent with what they have already said or done, especially in public, and even more particularly in your presence. So if you can arrange for people to take a position, even a smaller position in that is logically congruent with the position you want them to take later, the fact that they have taken that step, have publicly advocated that position, significantly increases the likelihood that they will take the next step in order to be consistent with what they have already said or done in your presence.
Authority. This is an interesting one because we've just talked about how we shouldn't exert too much power to coerce or force
Yeah,
someone to do something. So, how does authority play into this?
this is really a good question because it divides authority into two camps. One is people who are in authority and who can exert power, right? And people who, all right, who, let me say this, people who are in authority or who are known as authorities, right? They have the expertise and background and knowledge and competence that you want to follow them. They can be gone if they give you a recommendation, right? And you see that person as a true authority. That person can leave the scene, doesn't have to observe you, doesn't have to monitor you. You will still follow that recommendation because that person is an authority on the topic.
Competence. How much does that have to play into recognizing one's authority?
Enormously, but there's a second factor: trustworthiness. That is the single most effective persuaders that we have ever registered all over the world is the credible authority, right? A person who has competence, expertise, know-how, and trustworthiness so that you will be willing to believe and incorporate that expert information, right? That person is not trying to serve their own interests, not trying to line their own pockets. They're honestly trying to depict reality for you. That guy, that woman, that guy, that group, whatever it is, they will be the ones you follow because it makes sense. It's adaptive to follow the lead of people who are both expert and honest.
Social proof is an interesting one. Now, do you have to be famous per se to be influential?
No, not at all. You just have to point to the fact that a lot of other people are behaving in ways that are congruent with your recommendation or proposal. You just show them that what it is that you're recommending is something that a lot of other people, like the audience member, like him or her, are doing or have been doing in the past. So, for example, in the UK, if the tax office included one sentence in the letter to delinquent taxpayers, besides telling them what the penalties will be if they don't pay their tax, they included one sentence that said the majority of UK citizens are do pay their taxes on time, are doing so, right? It increased um, it increased revenues by $1 billion. It's called the $1 billion letter in the UK tax office, but it should be the $1 billion sentence, just telling people what those around them, like them, are doing. This is why uh, we get runs of various sorts. We get various kinds of bubbles because we see that other people like us are doing it, and that's enough. We stop looking at the merits of the case. And we just look at the fact that others are doing it, which seems to be proof enough.
And finally, the scarcity aspect. What do you mean by that?
Scarcity is people want more of what they can have less of. So if you can honestly tell people that what you have is unique or scarce or uncommon or dwindling in availability, they'll be significantly more likely to accept your recommendation, your proposal, because people want what they can't have.
In your research, many years of research on this topic, can you uh, tell us about one or two examples of somebody that you found to be exceedingly good at persuasion and or highly influential per your definition?
Okay, I'm going to choose Warren Buffett.
Okay.
And here's what he does. Remember, I said the important when you're an authority that people want to follow, you can't just be known as effective. You also have to be known as trustworthy, right? So here's what Warren Buffett does on the letters to shareholders every year. Now, I've been a shareholder, Berkshire Hathaway, for over 25 years. And I've been reading those letters. Here's what he does every year, David. On the first or second page of the letter, he describes something that went poorly that year, a mistake he made. And then he says, and by the way, this will never happen again because we've learned our lesson. But believe me, I'm not infallible. I make mistakes, right? Every time I read that, I say to myself, wow, this guy's being straight with us. What else is he saying? And then he says, but it's very important that he says, but, or however, or nonetheless, he bridges to the strengths of the year, all the things they did right that year, right? And, right, that's where he puts and that's when you're paying the most credible attention to him because he's just demonstrated himself to be trustworthy. He's not just pulling a blanket of positivity over your eyes. He's giving you the straight scoop. He's willing to talk about the weaknesses as well as the strengths of his case. And then he says, but here's the weakness, but that wipe out the strengths. And you're saying, oh, this is a credible source of information. Well, when you say that, it's the moment that you're paying attention to his strengths. It's brilliant. Okay, that's one. Here's another one. Now, you mentioned these 6 principles of influence. I've added a 7th. It's called unity. The idea that we say yes to those people who we share values with, we share identities with, we share goals with, we feel a sense of oneness with, right? So here's what Warren did on the 50th anniversary of Berkshire Hathaway, when there was talk that, well, Warren and Charlie are getting older. What happens when one or another of them pass? Maybe we should think about selling our shares because that's going to be an inevitability. So here's what he said. He said, look, I'll tell you now about the future of Berkshire, the very positive future of Berkshire, in the same way I would tell a family member. And I remember reading it and rocking back in my chair. You mean you're considering me in the same way you would consider a family member? You mean we have that kind of unity? And I've never sold that. I've never sold that share, despite the opinions at the time that this would be the time to unload it. It's since gone up dramatically since then.
The term influencer has been used with pejorative connotations in today's society, with a lot of people online showing a lot of the principles of persuasion that we've talked about, but not being very credible, or perhaps misleading their influencees down a wrong moral path, shall we say.
Right.
Now, how do we know that whatever influencer that we follow is credible and or
Right.
telling the truth? How do we differentiate a liar from a credible influencer like Warren Buffett that maybe you? Yeah.
Well, if you haven't had, first of all, if you had experience with them, you know that they fooled you, they cheated you, they tricked you, right? So that's one way. The other is, and here's what I recommend. Get online, be aggressive, be counterattack. We can't allow those cheaters to be unpenalized. So if that's the case, we have to go and say so in as many sites and to as many of our networks as we can. But if we don't know, we have to go online. We've got information there that we've never had until there was the internet, where we can get all kinds of reviews and comments and experiences from people all over the world who may have dealt with this person. And that way we can equip ourselves with the kind of knowledge that helps us deflect that kind of influencer.
I've also read research that during the pandemic, when there were supply chain issues, companies that have, I guess, admitted to their own faults, or perhaps admitted to why internally there were problems, as opposed to just blaming their problems on supply chain issues, those companies ended up doing better with their stock performance in the long term. Did you observe this at all?
I have seen that study, and I know, and that's exactly what Warren Buffett does. He says,
Right.
this was, and we fixed it now. We that won't ever happen again because we learned from that. And that study showed, this was in the annual reports of Fortune 500 CEOs. Right? If they said, this happened and it was our fault, we didn't have the people in the right place for it, or we didn't have the right training, or whatever it was our fault. Versus, oh no, it was a supply line or a weather issue, something. 1 year later, the one who took responsibility for it had significantly higher stock price. So if you want to know who to invest in, look at
Yeah.
their look at their annual reports and
Yeah.
see if they're taking responsibility and saying, this isn't the case anymore, that this will ever happen to you. We fixed it. It says you have control of your company, where the other person says, I don't have control. You don't want to invest in that person.
Well, that's a good segue. Let's talk about applications of psychology to business now. Now, you've advised some of the biggest tech companies in the world, Google, Microsoft, for example. What have they done? And more specifically, how have they applied your research to make their brand stand out? And like you said, looking for indicators to pick investments. They've been standout investments over the last 20 years.
Yeah. So they I advise them to use the principles of influence. I advise them to make sure that people understand what's unique or uncommon about them, right? Or how they have they have authority just by virtue of their track record or the fact that there are people who would endorse them, true experts who would testify for their success. Uh, and also, here's one that has to do with social proof, the thing that says if a lot of other people are doing it, then it's probably the right thing to do for me if those people are similar, right? The newest research shows what if you're a startup and you don't have a lot of other people moving in your you can't point to market share or popularity. If you've got a trend, if you can show it 6 months ago, we had this, 3 months ago, we have this, today, we have this number of whatever the metric is, right? That's enough, even though it's a low number at the top, right? Because it's the trend that causes people to project it into the future that it will be much more popular and effective down the road.
How much of the valuation of these companies is based on the fact that there's legitimately good products there versus the psychology of crowding in to a brand like Apple because my friends use Apple, my friends have an iPod and an iPhone, therefore I should probably use it. Everyone else says it's good. I don't know anything about tech, but I should follow the herd.
Yeah, there's no question that both of those are applicable, of course. But the thing that moves you over the simple merits of the case that Apple's good is that network, is that social proof that the people around you, like you, are doing it and benefiting from it. That's the thing that leaps you up into the elite levels of success.
What is the psychological phenomenon that drives asset bubbles when everyone crowds into a certain trade, whether it be a meme stock with no value, or let's say tulips a couple hundred years ago, or let's say a cryptocurrency that spiked up in value and popped. Asset bubbles form over and over again. Can we use psychology to explain why?
Yeah. And we use two of the factors we talked about. One is social proof. You see everybody moving in that direction, right?
Yeah.
The other is scarcity. If I don't get in now, I'm going to lose. I'm going to lose because it's going to go up and I'll have to get in at a much more expensive place. So it's those two combined and they're deadly.
So would you actually consult or advise large corporations to limit production then to maintain an air of scarcity, perhaps even to the detriment of maximizing overall revenue?
Here's what I would say. If you do that not just to trick people, but you do that to limit your resources to establishing a better product, and that is to channel your resources. So you say, we're not going to do 100,000 of this model of automobile or whatever it is, right? Because we're going to work on making sure that we maintain the quality and enhance the quality. That's where our resources are going. Well, people are going to want it even more because not only is it scarce, it's scarce not as a trick. It's scarce for a reason having to do with the features of the outcome that you get from it.
Now, it's been reported, I've seen studies that show about 80% of Fortune 500 companies use personality testing to gauge whether or not their employees are a good fit for the company. Tests like the Myers-Briggs, Big Five personality test, the cattle test. What would you say these are effective measures of whether or not someone is a good fit?
Depends on which one you use. Myers-Briggs happens to have very little um, research base for its effectiveness. It's widely used, but very little evidence that it's good. Depends on which one you use, right? But I would say that yes, but the one that I see as rising above personalities is competence. The extent to which you have experience or competence already in the job uh, description that you're recruiting for. That's the one that predicts better than any of the personality scales.
Let's say I'm an investor and I'm picking a company to invest in, many companies like this, and I like to understand whether or not the company's culture is I guess um, conducive to adding shareholder value going forward. What sorts of questions should I be asking myself?
So here's the one that we've done some research on. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but is this an ethical culture, an ethical corporate culture? Because what we found is that inside the organ, even though you may be using advertisements and marketing schemes that are less than honest, and you may be fooling your customers, you're not fooling the people inside your organization about the dishonesty. And we have found three things that devastate your bottom line if that's your culture long term, right? One is people are stressed by that and their productivity goes down, something we call moral stress. They're just conflicted and frustrated that they have to cheat, right, in their job. Then you get turnover as a result. Those people who are uncomfortable with that turnover leave, and the costs of turnover are enormous, enormous. And then finally, and this is the one I like the best because nobody else found this before, because the people who leave are the ones who are are not comfortable with cheaters and being cheaters, what's left is a precipitate of dishonest individuals inside your organization who are comfortable with cheating, and they will cheat you. The costs of theft and under the table deals go up significantly because you've pulled the viper under your coat.
What if we add an element of reward to this cheating? Suppose management, is not ethical and you're working for this team and you know that there's a lot of under the table shady dealings, but you are rewarded for that. You are given a cut of the pie if you do cheat along with everybody else. Does your incentive to change or leave the company change?
Yes, of course it does. I mean, that's the rule of. I mean, nobody would doubt that people move in the direction of, but it doesn't change the fact that there are other consequences of that. So maybe not performance,
Mm-hmm.
but there will be people who are still uncomfortable with this, and you've generated a culture of cheating. Those people will cheat you.
Well,
Count on it. You've
that
selected for it.
that leads to my ultimate question as to how to incentivize your team. Suppose you are the manager. How do you influence, shall we say, your team to A, be motivated to add to the company's bottom line, and B, not leave the company?
Yeah, well, it is by being honest. Change your corporate culture, and
Okay.
then they don't have to worry about those internal issues.
Well, if you were to evaluate pay, wages on in the grand scheme of the scale versus other more qualitative factors, how important is money?
Money is important, but I'll tell you, I taught a course, an MBA course at Stanford a few years ago, and
Yeah.
I asked the students to give me examples of places where they work where they had a effective culture or an ethical one versus a not. And one guy said, he worked for this company that started out like gangbusters because they were being dishonest in a lot of ways, but it eventually caught up to them. But the way the CEO tried to keep people was to increase the pay. So they got higher pay than at rivals, right? And some of them stayed, but they were the ones who were comfortable with cheating. They're going to cheat you. And he said by the end, when he left because he couldn't take it, right? And then he came back just to check in with his friends. They were almost all gone. Everybody had bailed out, and the company was in a tailspin because the dishonesty had caught up with them outside of the organization, not just inside.
Let's extend psychology to the nation state level. So suppose we have a conflict. Let's call, Israel, Palestine, or Ukraine, Russia, whatever the case may be. Um, how do we apply the principles of persuasion to diplomacy?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is scarcity. What
Hmm.
you're going to lose. The Daniel Kahneman, our Nobel Prize laureate who recently passed away, won the Nobel Prize for his prospect theory that says that the prospects of losing a unit of value are significantly more powerful psychologically than the prospects of gaining that same thing. So, what we have to explain to people is what they will lose if they fail to take these steps, and how the opportunities to take those steps are dwindling in availability. That would be the way. That's a human drive to seize uh, rare or unique or dwindling opportunities of value. That's theirs in childhood. We install that in our children. By 2 years old, you see a willingness to go for the scarce option rather than the plentiful one.
I guess, practically speaking, if you were to advise the State Department on resolving a conflict of, let's say, mediating a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, right? What are some of the steps they need to be taking?
Well, some of those steps are to tell them that these are the things we are willing to do for you, right, to make this happen, each side. But there's a limit. There's a time limit on this. We can only do this for so long because of certain political pressures or whatever. And you will lose these opportunities. You will lose our support unless you do this. Not just that you will gain more support if you do it, you will lose it if you don't. Loss is more powerful than gain.
Okay. All right. Well, let's bring it back to personal use cases. So suppose I'm at work and I want to negotiate for a raise. What are some of the characteristics or aspects that I should be highlighting here?
Yeah. So we can say the same thing about scarcity. You can make a case for yourself of what you have of value that will be lost because of what you've already done and what you know and what you are capable of doing, that they're not going to be able to get in some newbie, some rookie who comes into your spot, right? Uh, but you can also use the idea of um, commitment and consistency. You can say, to whatever your boss's name, I really appreciated how you've always felt that it's important to have people who have this and this and that characteristic. Look at my record. I have all of them. So we're on the same page. We are aligned. So you want to be, so I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to our continued alignment along those basic values. But you have to go back and find them, those things that the boss said or wrote, and raise it to the surface and say, well, this is you've already committed to this. So I'm so glad to be uh, working with you and looking forward to working with you in the future.
How do you know if someone's lying?
It turns out there's some research on whether people are good lie detectors or not, and it's not what they say. It's their um, it's their body language. There are subtle cues of body language that are tip-offs, but they're not for sure thing. I mean, you don't really know, but you can tell about the way in which people lean toward you or lean away from you, separate from you, put their hands over their chest like this, kind of protecting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Those kinds of things. But for me, I think that's minor compared to what's this person's history of lying, right?
Right.
That's your best guess.
Okay. Well, how effective are lie detecting machines? I mean, isn't it possible that someone's just nervous?
Yeah, those are right. And so those are outlawed in most states, lie detectors for interrogations because they're so unstable and unpredictable.
Finally, how would you I guess, instruct someone to learn how to become more influential. I'll give you an example. So, someone technically competent people may benefit from learning the principles of persuasion. A Pew report in 2023 found that the public's trust in scientists has been waning over time. One quarter of the people surveyed say that they don't have confidence in what scientists are saying are in the public's interest, right? So let's take competent people in their domains, scientists, for example. How can they become more influential?
They have to take Warren Buffett's lead and say, science is not certain. There's no certainty in science.
Mm.
Everybody makes mistakes. There are these glitches that occur, and they have been publicized lately. But look at the advances we've made, and then you should be naming them in medicine, in pharmacology, in transportation, in health, and so on, that you can attribute directly to science. Without science, you wouldn't have those. Those would be lost to you. That's the way I would do it.
Before I let you go, Dr. Cialdini, you mentioned Warren Buffett as an influential figure. Anybody who has influenced you personally over your career that has really moved the way you think?
Um, yeah, but it's somebody nobody else would know. It's a guy named William McGuire, who was a professor at Yale University and a great professor of psychology. And he showed me something. He said, in over the 4,000 centuries of human development, there were only four centuries where persuasion was trained and taught as a craft. And in the first three, the political leaders, had the persuasion experts killed. Because persuasion was a source of influence they didn't have a monopoly over. It wasn't brute force, but not the last one. This one that we're in right now, the persuasion effort authorities are now seeking the information of the experts rather than trying to dispatch them. Why? Because the information comes from the scientific method. It doesn't come from a person, from the mind of a person, like Aristotle, just thinking through what works. No, it comes from a procedure. Well, anybody can do that procedure again and get the knowledge back. So you can't eliminate persuasion as a source of control by just eliminating the experts. They will always be able to get it back.
Okay, well, tell us how we can find your current work, learn more about you, and tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing at the Cialdini Institute.
Yeah, so I put these principles in a book called Influence, the
Hmm.
Psychology of Persuasion, and there's a new version of it, new and expanded. But the biggest thing we're doing now is something called the Cialdini Institute, where we do online, on demand training in ethical influence for business audiences. So it's research based, ethical, and applied to the business context.
Okay, and we'll put the links to the website
Great.
down below so people can check that out. So make sure to read Dr. Cialdini's book, which Charlie Munger recommended to everybody. So
Yeah.
make sure make sure to follow that and follow the Cialdini Institute. Thank you very much, Dr. Cialdini.
Thank you, David. Good questions.
Thank you, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.